Good afternoon. This is the Crowded Booth live from the Tate Student Center here in Athens, Georgia on the campus of University of Georgia. We are here today. I'm joined by my good friend Brandon Sudge. He works with the Macon Telegraph, just covering all around Georgia sports. And today we're going to review, obviously, if you were there last week, you had the national championship game, Brandon, that was, from my perspective, it was a great game. A college football fan that I am, it was a really good game. And for Alabama fans, it was one of the greatest comebacks they've had in recent history, and for Georgia fans, it was a painful, heartbreaking loss. But definitely you were there, so we're going to be able to talk about that and cover that, and then also be able to take a look about Georgia's future and what does the foundation for Georgia look like and what all that does for them. But first thing I want to talk about is your reaction from the game. I mean, obviously, talking with some people who are big Alabama fans, and one guy in particular, he was just saying, from Alabama's perspective, probably not their best game, but they were able to tough it out. And Nick Saban, his post-game press conference, he was really excited how his team prevailed. But from a Georgia perspective, what would you say the reaction was?
Yeah, I mean, first off, for an Alabama fan, that might be one of the most gratifying national championships of the 6 or so that Nick Saban has won. Just because it was in the impressive comeback fashion, and it involved a lot of true freshmen, Tua Tagovailoa, Najee Harris, Devontae Smith, just a bunch of young guys who maybe didn't see the limelight throughout the season, but were thrown into that big situation and performed pretty well. But from a Georgia perspective, I mean, I've been around the team since August, been covering the team week by week, and I didn't think Georgia was afraid by Alabama. I thought it was a game that Georgia was ready for. I thought Georgia was relishing the opportunity to avenge a 38-10 2015 loss with a lot of those same players from that game. But anyway, being up in the box and seeing the game from an up-high perspective, I feel like Georgia had a bunch of things clicking for it in the first half. I mean, Georgia offensively opened up with 7 consecutive passes, and you're like, well, they have 2 running backs, why don't they run the ball? And, Kirby Smart said post-game that he wanted to try to loosen Alabama up early, and it worked as Georgia had set up the touchdown by Mecole Hardman at the end of the half, and had a couple of field goals mixed in, and then that transferred over on the defensive end where they held Jalen Hurts, who's 26-2 as the starting quarterback,
26-2,
and is not a bad quarterback. Held him just 21 yards and did a successful job at stymieing an Alabama rushing attack, which has star players, just like Georgia's backfield did. But things kind of changed there after the intermission. I'm not sure what the demeanor was in the locker room. Kirby said post-game again that he told his players that to warn them that Tua Tagovailoa would come in the game for Alabama. And he thought it would happen because they needed momentum, they needed a spark, and obviously he brought it, as was shown by his staggering second-half performance. However, I was speaking to a couple of players post-game, and their responses were kind of different in terms of how the situation was handled. I had one player that told me that they prepare for every player on the two deep every week, and they knew that both Jalen Hurts and Tua could
have that opportunity to play. Yeah,
could provide problems. And then I spoke to another player who said they were in on Hurts and they knew that he was good, and they had kind of invested all their time there. So there were definitely times where it looked like they weren't prepared for Tua, and he showed it with some passes to Calvin Ridley, some useful run plays which involved spinning out of the backfield on that 3rd and 9. But if we kind of look deeper in the second half there, Georgia had a 20-7 lead, and people can blame the loss on penalties, whether it be Tyler Simmons' offsides call, which, in my opinion, there was a false start on Alabama also.
So if they're going to get that correct call,
it would have been negated either way.
But for our viewers, it was not offsides.
No.
I mean, if you go back and look, it was not offsides.
If you go watch the video, he was onside.
But like you said, that false start would have negated if they got the right call.
You can point fingers at the DeAndre Swift face mask that was missed.
Mm-hmm.
You can point fingers at 4 or 5 other different plays that were missed and not called in Georgia's favor. And it's safe to say that the Big Ten officiating crew, led by Dan Capron, didn't have a very good game.
Mm-hmm.
However, Georgia had a 20-7 lead, and you can't let that go because every mistake you make, especially against a team with the caliber of Alabama and the prestige of Alabama, and a coach like Nick Saban who's been there, done that, against a coach like Kirby who's been there, done that, but in a different role, and with a bunch of not inexperienced, but players that haven't been in that spot before. So you look at Jake Fromm's pick at the end. You look at a potentially changed offensive attack there, and I spoke to players, and their responses were, no, we didn't change anything. That they have trust in the game plan, but it was self-inflicted mistakes, and that might be true. But going back to what I had said about opening the game with 7 straight passes in the second half, there wasn't much of a pass game to be found. Mm-hmm. And when they ran the ball, the Bulldogs opted to run with Nick Chubb, who was not having success early on. And you go back to the mantra of chopping wood, keep going, and they tried to wear him down. I understand that, but maybe you needed to find more of a balance there. Or maybe just run it with a guy like Sonny Michel more.
He was having a great game.
He was having a great game. 14 carries, 95 yards. However, Sonny Michel didn't have a fourth quarter carry, which didn't really make sense to me. And he had busted open a couple of significant runs there. So maybe Georgia could have found some offensive rhythm and offensive flow if it had changed some things. But you say if this, if that, Georgia had its opportunity again in overtime after Alabama place kicker Andy Papanastis missed a kick wide to the left, and Georgia opened up the overtime with a field goal. You go back to the start of Alabama's overtime drive, 1st and 10. Davin Bellamy comes off the right side there and sacks to a Tiger Haloa for a 15-yard loss, and I was down on the sideline at that point because the media had the opportunity to go down to the sideline and see the end of the game, and I could just hear the elation from the horde of Georgia fans that were in the stadium.
And it was like 75-25.
It was 65-35, 70-30.
Close, something close to being Georgia fans' favorite in that building.
Yes.
Kind of a home away from home is, I think, the mantra they had around Atlanta was Georgia trying to play a home game where they'd already played there, about a month earlier.
Yeah, Georgia already played there once, and they had all their fans there too, and it was back again. But anyway, you could just feel that sense of elation. Like, this might happen, Like, everything has gone Georgia's way in the past 5 minutes or so. Like, this might happen. And then 1 play later, 10 seconds later, the events don't go in Georgia's favor, and Tagovailoa finds another true freshman, Devontae Smith, 41 yards down the field for a score. Now, you can say if this, if that, but Georgia didn't get it done, but I do think that this is just the beginning of where things are headed for Georgia, and Kirby said it best that they're not going anywhere. I don't think they are. There are no guarantees, but I think this does set the standard, as Kirby and players have said. So I just want to throw it back over on your end in terms of and get some of your perspective on where you think this program's headed.
Yeah, I mean, you wrapped that game up beautifully. I mean, that was kind of like I think the biggest thing, and obviously, texting you a little bit a couple of days afterward and hearing that was the toughest thing was the elation you talked about with that 15-yard sack by Bellamy. I mean, they had been gashing Georgia, you know, in the second half, and to get that sack from a kid that, as a freshman, stepped up and they finally got him. They finally were able to trap him in the backfield. And then, kind of just like a dagger in the heart there. I mean,
and that's also something that Georgia's had to do all year on the defensive end. You look at the Notre Dame game, week 2, the Notre Dame had the last possession of the game.
Yeah, and they were able to get that turnover.
And Georgia was able to get it, and Oklahoma did the same thing. Baker Mayfield going on the field with less than a minute left, and like in a tie ball game, and Georgia was able to get that stop, send it overtime. So in that situation, you thought that Georgia would do it again just because they have all year.
Yeah, and they were a clutch team. I mean, Davin Bellamy, probably not a household name nationally. I mean, other than his comments to Baker Mayfield after that post-game loss, or the post-game win for Georgia, probably not a national name, but, I mean, he came up in some clutch moments for Georgia fans this year. I mean, that Notre Dame game, I mean, just a pass rusher that seemed to be there at the right time.
And it also helps when you have Lorenzo Carter on the other end there. So,
when you have two pass rushers like that coming to the edge, you pick and choose your battle.
I mean, offenses don't really know which one to focus on because if one gets loose, then that quarterback might have his face headed toward the turf there in a couple seconds.
Yeah, definitely. So, I like that. And then moving on, what does it mean? And my next topic was some key points. And, I mean, you really hit that big Mo plays of the game, big momentum shifters.
Yeah.
And you highlighted that. So, as we move on to where they're headed now, obviously, we're going to focus a little bit more on Georgia today with you. But from an Alabama perspective, Saban ties Bear Bryant, national championship. I mean, that's huge. Alabama, some people are like, is the dynasty over? I feel like that question comes up all the time, is the dynasty over? And then they win it.
I feel like the question comes up about once a year, and Alabama's just like, no, we're not going anywhere.
And Alabama proved they should be in the playoff. They're definitely the top team in the nation.
I mean, the whole debate between Alabama and Ohio State really doesn't make much sense anymore.
I don't think, even though Ohio State put a beat down on USC, and USC was not the team that people thought. And that's a whole nother show we could do there. But, definitely, just talking about the state of the program, I mean, Alabama's in good shape. You're talking about all those freshmen. I mean, all the freshmen they have. But you flip it on to Georgia's side, and you've covered these guys, and you've covered a little bit of the recruiting aspect for them. Obviously, the big names. And one name that sticks out to me personally, just because, being in the Rome area, Adam Anderson. He's going to be coming and maybe filling a pass rushing void for Georgia with Carter and all these guys going to the NFL, hopefully. So you got guys like that. Obviously, Justin Fields, Zamir White, Cook. I mean, just big names in that recruiting classes. I think on early signing day, it felt like for Georgia fans, they were kind of invincible. They're like, that 5-star, he's coming too. So I think that was really big for Georgia fans to see just how well Kirby Smart's recruited and kind of brought that mantra, like you said, from Alabama, where Nick Saban, and it works, and he's done a good job at Georgia. But what could you say, just a future, just in, kind of obviously that you could talk about that for an hour and a half. We could sit here and talk about that for an hour and a half, but just a little bit about what exactly does Georgia have in the future for them, and do you feel like this is a team? Because one thing we touched on, talking previously, this is mostly the same team from last year. Not much has changed, and that just goes to testament of Kirby Smart and his coaching staff. I love the coaching staff. I love Mel Tucker. I think he does a great job over at Georgia, and he was getting interviewed for the Tennessee job there for a little bit.
He might not be at Georgia much longer. However, while he's there, Georgia will use him in every way.
And people love it seems like every other Saturday, Jim Chaney needs to be fired. Jim Chaney needs to get out of here. We love Jim Chaney now. We love Jim Chaney. So that's something that this is going to come with coaching. But I think he's surrounded himself with a good staff and got some young guys. Now they had some guys leave from the coaching staff, and that's just a product of having a program like that. But he has done a good job of filling in. I don't know the guy's name from Memphis they brought in, but he was under Nick Saban, I think, at Alabama for a while, wasn't he?
Yes, they brought in Dan Lanning. He was the inside linebackers coach and a recruiting coordinator at Memphis.
Okay.
Worked under Kirby Smart in the past. Worked under Nick Saban.
So a little bit of familiarity there.
Kirby seems to develop a pattern of signing guys that he's familiar with.
Yeah.
And so I would imagine he could be an asset both on the field and on the recruiting trail. He's outside linebackers, not inside linebackers. But going back to what you were saying about the whole Nick Saban's tying Bear Bryant thing, I also think if you look back at Kirby's first 2 years versus Nick's 2 years, they're very, very similar. They have a lot of parallel. Nick was able to get his team to the Sugar Bowl in year 2, and Kirby brought his second-year team to new heights with the national championship appearance. and as you were saying, it is a lot of the same team, other than guys like Jake Fromm.
Yeah, those freshman guys.
The freshmen, Jake Fromm, DeAndre Swift, Monty Rice, and those contributors. It was a lot of the same team, and people say that Jake Fromm was kind of the difference. He might have been. Would things have been okay with Jacob Eason behind center? Yes, I think so. He was a 5-star, highly touted quarterback, and during his freshman season, Georgia fans saw how his arm was. And I think that could translate to good things for him at his next step at the University of Washington and the NFL. But so the reason that Kirby is able to create this success so early, it's because of the work that he does on the recruiting trail, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in my memory, this is the best class Georgia's had.
Yeah, I mean, in a while.
In a long time. You go to that early signing period, and then you just wake up and you see the guys that are committed come in. So you're like, okay, for Georgia fans, that's good to not have any surprise flips and have any of that. And then all the dominoes started to fall in the afternoon. You know?
And one thing you could tell is like some of the guys on social media were like, sending little emojis out there. It's like they knew. And I think that was one big thing, we talked about last year. Richard LeCount was a guy for that recruiting class that kind of recruited other guys to come. And you saw the domino fall. I think once Justin Fields committed, if I'm not mistaken, last October, you saw some guys like, well, I want to play with that guy. And that speaks volumes because when you can get a recruiting class like that to come in, it's great. And you're talking about the parallels between Nick and Alabama. Alabama, if you're just now an Alabama fan, that team is not the same team that when Nick took over. I mean, they're still a storied historical program, but that program is a lot different. And the biggest thing I think Kirby talked about when he first came in was they didn't really have that depth, the depth that they wanted. They had some talented guys. I mean, this team that Georgia had was very talented. I think you saw a little bit more of that, and that's just going to be something to keep building if Georgia continued to get top 5 recruiting classes.
And then as this afternoon domino started to fall, you had guys like Kay Mays and Brenton Cox and Channing Tindall and just a whole series of guys that might have been surprises to Georgia fans, but I don't think they were surprises to those coaches.
Yeah, I think those guys knew that they had something coming in there alongside Georgia. Because guys like Kay Mays that was committed to Tennessee, I mean, and you would probably know a little bit better, he was committed to Tennessee for a while.
Yeah, he was committed. Kay Mays' father was actually a player at Tennessee.
So,
and he was from Knoxville, and he was ready to follow his father's legacy, and then the whole coaching change started to occur, which again we could do a whole show on that.
Yeah, and as a guy that's covering Georgia sports, seeing that would probably be a nightmare for a Tennessee guy to cover that was going on with Tennessee and all their issues. But they got a good coach in Jeremy Pruitt, former Bulldog. But if you just keep going on that, I mean.
So after the early signing period, you just had these dominoes start to fall, and Georgia currently stands with the top class in the country. And they could get a couple more 5-stars with guys like Tyson Campbell and Isaac Taylor Stewart, a couple of those defensive backs that are 5-stars, and a couple of them were here this weekend actually. But those are guys that are considering Georgia significantly, and guys that Georgia could use in a defensive backfield that's sort of lost a lot of older players now due to graduation and departure of the NFL draft.
And guys like Aaron Davis, who comes in as a walk-on and works his butt off. I mean, from an outside perspective, you see him play. I mean, he looks like a guy that's been doing it for 4 years. And so him as a senior leaving, Dominic Sanders, which I'm not mistaken, was he tied or
he tied the school record?
Was it with Kirby Smart that he tied it with?
I think I might have topped Kirby Smart.
Might have topped it, but 16 career interceptions at Georgia.
And he almost had that one in the national title game that would have given him the school record and would have cemented the win. However, that's
and so guys like that you got to replace. I mean, you could do a whole show on guys that had their place and how's this guy going to step up and. Replacing those guys and getting guys in. I mean, the areas of need. And I was at the basketball game yesterday. I was able to see Kirby Smart sitting over there with. I think was it Tyson Campbell? Is that his name?
Rick Sandage. He was a
Rick Sandage,
tackle.
Yeah, and guys like that. I mean, that's big for. And Kirby Smart. I mean, as on a national stage, we've always known he's a good recruiter. I mean, and watching him at Alabama, I've seen that he's a great recruiter. I mean, getting some guys there, and probably, you know, when he was hired by Georgia after the championship, Nick Saban was a little emotional. Like he'd been there for a while with Nick. So that's something that speaks volumes. I just think about the depth and the future of this team. It's definitely bright with those recruiting guys and the guys that are already here, like a DeAndre Swift, a Jake Fromm, because they're only going to get better.
Yeah. And I think if you look at next year's team, I think you've got more potential and more talent. You've got a schedule that's in Georgia's favor.
No games at Notre Dame or anything.
There are no extremely difficult non-conference games on the road. You welcome Tennessee and Auburn to Sanford Stadium right behind us.
Yeah, and that I know Georgia fans are going to be ready for Tennessee to come back to Sanford Stadium.
I think they might after that 34-31.
And Auburn too. I mean,
yes.
That game 2 years ago here, electric atmosphere, and then the game at Auburn this year was a rough one.
The game against Auburn here in 2016 actually was Kirby Smart's first one against the top 10 team. So anyway, if you look at that schedule, it's in Georgia's favor. There's more potential for talent, but there's youth across the board. So it will be really interesting to see how things culminate throughout the season, how these players develop, and how these guys kind of buy in as a unit. If we kind of go position by position, Bryce, so where do you think that some of Georgia's areas for improvement maybe? Where do you see they might need an uptick after a couple of these guys head out?
Well, going ahead and knocking off some position groups, I mean, they're knowing and seeing Justin Fields' film, I mean, there's going to be some people that are like, we want him to start. He might give us the same thing. I think Georgia's good there. I mean, Jake Fromm established himself as a leader. Watching him in that Rose Bowl game, even the national championship game, he's wise man his years. So I think they're good there. The offensive line looks really good. I mean, some young guys, Cleveland and Thomas over there on the right side, they looked really good.
And then you could, it seems probable that Thomas will move to left. You put Isaiah Wilson, a guy who didn't play this year,
massive guy,
who redshirted his 70 pounds or so. Plug him in on the right side. You've got Lamont Gilliard at center. If he comes back, the deadline for NFL draft decisions is tomorrow. So we'll see on guys like Lamont Gilliard, DeAndre Baker, Roquan Smith.
Who has it? I mean, and you might know better than I do, and I don't know if you can share anything, but I don't know. I mean, what do you think he's leaning? And just talk about position groups. What do you think he's leaning to? Because if he leaves, that's a huge lead, not only position but leadership that Georgia's going to have to fill.
I don't know where he's leaning. I think it's still a tough decision for Roquan. I think he has a desire to stay here
and try to win the national championship. I think it may have been different. If
stay here to get an academic degree. Also, I do think that's important to him. However, being a potential first-round draftee, I don't know if you can pass that up. I don't know if I would pass that up. I don't know if I'd pass up that money. However, if you look at that linebacker group, Georgia also loses Reggie Carter, who's a rotator right next to Roquan Smith. You got a guy like Channing Tindall, who's coming in here for this coming season. He's a guy that Georgia might depend on in that position to contribute. You've got Trace Patrick, assuming he comes back from his off-the-field issues. But if Georgia can get Roquan Smith back in the fold, that would be really significant. Obviously, he led the team in tackles, was a Butkus Award winner for the nation's best linebacker. I mean, his value to Georgia's defense is very understated, and he was a leader of that defense last year. And on a group that doesn't return 10 out of 11 starters like it did, Georgia needs that leadership there. So, I guess we'll see in the next 24 hours or so
what he decides.
Yes,
and that'll be a big also for scouts. I mean, they want to see if he can he can play in the. We'll have the opportunity to be available in the draft. General managers across the NFL want to know that. But yeah, back to position groups. I feel like you really covered the linebackers, and they're going to have to fill. And we covered a little bit earlier. They're going to have to fill in Lorenzo Carter and Davin Bell, two senior guys.
That's why I think guys like Adam Anderson and Brent Cox, Adam Anderson you spoke about earlier, those guys are true pass rushers, and those guys want to get to that quarterback, and it might be a little rough early on as the jump from high school to college isn't easy. So, however, I think Georgia can use those guys. They can use a guy like Malik Herring, who was a freshman this year, playing on third downs a lot, and a guy that nobody talks about, Deandre Walker.
DeAndre Walker had I think was it 2 big sacks against Oklahoma.
Yes.
I mean, in Baker Mayfield.
DeAndre Walker is one of Georgia's best defensive players and didn't start. He was a rotator, and he was at the top of the list in team tackles. I mean, the guy did not play every snap, but every snap he was on the field, he looked to have an impact. So DeAndre Walker is a guy that can help those guys because he will come in as a senior next year. He's a guy that can help those younger kids develop while being impactful in Kirby Smart's defensive group.
And one guy that I loved, I mean Trenton Thompson, he's gone.
Yes.
He is declared for the draft. One guy I liked was Marshall.
Yes.
David Marshall.
Yes.
David Marshall, number 51, I think it was.
David Marshall, yes.
Watching him, he's a force to be reckoned with down there. And he's a pretty talented player.
You'll have David Marshall, Jonathan Ledbetter. I believe he said before the Rose Bowl he plans to come back. However, that is not anything official yet. So David Marshall, Tyler Clark, who was fantastic against Oklahoma, and the national title game, had a really good finish to his sophomore year. And then you have David Marshall right there next to him. Georgia loses John Atkins on the D line, and
underrated guy.
His loss goes very undervalued and very understated. He's the guy that did all the dirty work for Georgia. He didn't get all the fame, didn't rack up the stats, but he was the guy that did the dirty work for Georgia and cleaned things up and got in his gap, and it was really a big part of Georgia's defense, which ranked in the top 5 nationally this season.
Yeah, and I think that you talk about guys that can really plug holes, and that's what Georgia did. I mean, if you watching their film from that year and some of the highlights, they were able to allow, and that really, Roquan is a talented player. He could get off blocks. We saw that.
Yes.
But when you let a guy like Roquan be able to run freely to the ball, that's dangerous. And that was one thing that a lot of teams had trouble with Georgia. I mean, they couldn't get to that second level and block him. But I think, you go on that. The 2 positions, I feel like, and you can tell me because you have a little bit better knowledge, I feel like Georgia, obviously the tailback position's there, but, DeAndre Swift, they got some guys coming in.
Yeah.
I think the 2 positions would be defensive back. We talked about some recruits coming in there.
Yes.
And maybe the wide receiver position, because we saw Javon Wims elevate his game. Well, he's gone. Godwin's from good talent. They got some young guys.
Yeah.
Do you think, and I'll direct this to you, do you think that Riley Ridley is a guy that we could see? he had an amazing national championship game.
I think we saw that in Atlanta last week. I feel like Riley Ridley could finally emerge as that kind of go-to guy. He entered in as a freshman, and it was like, oh, Riley Ridley, he's a brother of Calvin, so he's going to do some pretty good things. And not because he's his brother, but he showed glimpses of his skill set and glimpses of his talent in Atlanta. He's dealt with off-field issues. He's dealt with some injuries, but if he can plug in there on the X position and kind of just fill in for Wims there and produce like he did, then Jake Fromm will have somebody that he can trust in those important situations to throw to. Him and then Mecole Hardman.
Who will be developed as a real threat
who
for
will
Georgia.
be a third-year receiver and can be explosive on returns, kickoff, and punt, as we saw this year. I was surprised he didn't break.
There were a couple, and one thing we talked about, before we got into this was he was a guy that watching a lot of Georgia games this year, just with how talented that group was. He was a guy that he had some miscues earlier in the year. But he owned up to it. He had a drop ball.
Yeah, he
and
did.
Then he had the last big mistake that I can remember, and I'm not watching every single play, and I'm not there, but the last play I remember is the muffed punt at Auburn.
Yes.
And I've said this multiple times on this show, that I've continued to come back to the Georgia-Auburn game in Jordan-Hare. That game is the testament to Georgia. Everything that went wrong in that one game for Georgia.
That's true.
So
that's true.
Anything that you point out, but he definitely turned around in a fantastic player. We saw him in the wild dog format there with him lined up at quarterback, and I think it was Michelle or Chubb to his left.
They had Sonny Michelle right to his right, and he faked it to Michelle, and he loops around the end there for the touchdown. He's just a guy that that offensive coordinator Jim Chaney has built that trust in. He knows he can depend on him to be an asset in a number of different ways, whether it be in the Wildcat, whether it be a receiver, just wherever they need him, and he's answered that call. He's one of Georgia's biggest offensive weapons, and he will be a big piece in terms of Georgia's success next year.
Yeah, definitely. I think that guy, I mean, he's a fantastic a playmaker. When he gets the ball in his hands, I mean, defenses have to know where Mecole Hardman's on the field. I mean, he pretty much had a breakout game, if you want to call it that. For guys that have not watched Georgia, he had a really good game in the national championship game. And I think following along with that, we talked about I really liked watching, you had a lot of guys in that Georgia secondary. I really liked watching, was it DeAndre Baker?
Yes.
DeAndre Baker, number 18.
Yes.
And J.R. Reed, I liked watching him, who wasn't really expected to be that big of a contributor here at Georgia as a transfer from Tulsa.
J.R. Reed is the cousin of D'Angelo Gibbs. So they might have signed him to kind of us a little recruiting advantage.
Yeah, and if J.R. Reed's watching this by any off chance, with no disrespect,
no, that's no disrespect at all, because he got on that field and he showed that he can contribute, and he might be just as good as D'Angelo is.
Yeah, he got to wear those Savage pads quite a lot,
he did,
a lot this year.
Yes.
So I think they have a talented defensive backfield there. I mean, they got guys that can swarm the ball like a DeAndre Baker. So,
however, DeAndre Baker does have his NFL kind of
his NFL decision. Yeah, he does.
It's up in the air. So that's another big one that Georgia needs back. I mean,
and I think an overarching thing. You got guys that are going to fill in there, but the biggest one for me, I would be excited to see Richard LeCount. I saw him in. I think it was the Army All-American game.
Yeah, and he played in certain packages for Georgia. He actually started the year as a safety for Georgia. He's a guy that brings a lot of energy. He's a guy that provides that spark and is relentless in his style of play and things like that. I feel like Kirby Smart kind of tried to tame that down this season. He said that account kind of got out of hand with his energy at times, but if he can tame that down and if he can improve in his sophomore season, he's a guy that can kind of man that backfield along with Reed and along with Baker, and kind of provide some solidarity to a unit that was kind of up and down at times this year. I didn't think they were that they had a fantastic season every week. I feel like there were times when they were good.
And you saw that in the Missouri game. I mean, Missouri is what it is, but Drew Lock is a prolific passer.
And he's coming back.
He's coming back, too, from Missouri, and that's something they desperately needed. And for lack of better words, and luckily there's not too many fans around here, he kind of lit Georgia up in the secondary. He lit that Georgia secondary up. So that was something that wasn't necessarily a strong suit. Obviously the linebackers, the outside linebackers, the defensive line, everyone's hard. That Georgia front seven's dominant. I think that Kirby Smart, him being a
former D-back,
former DB himself, is going to definitely shore that up. But yeah, I think Georgia is in really good position for the future. I mean, it hurts for Georgia students here. I mean, being here on campus, everyone's just kind of like, it's a tough one. It's a tough one.
I came back on campus on Tuesday, and you just saw a bunch of solemn and straight faces from Georgia students. But I mean, Georgia fans can't be mad at how the season went. You're an SEC champion. You're a Rose Bowl champion. SEC champion for the first time in 12 years. I mean, that's something that Mark Richt was not able to do in his final few seasons here. And Kirby has shown that he elevated Georgia to a new height. And I don't think it's a fluke. I don't think that this is a one-year thing.
Like Kirby said, Georgia's here to stay. I mean, this is a program that's built for the long haul, trying to build to that mold of I don't know if Georgia fans love to hear this, but an Alabama of the East kind of thing, Maybe this is a launching point, for Georgia to get their foot in the ground and on the national stage.
And then I think for next year that it'll be sort of kind of the same couple of teams at the top. You'll have Georgia, Alabama, Clemson, Oklahoma, and then Ohio State, and I feel like it'll be those few programs just kind of battling out at the top, and I feel like those programs are kind of established themselves as of now as teams that have success on the recruiting trail and teams that have shown it to translate on the field.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Georgia's got a talented group coming back. Alabama does too. I mean, it's that might be a brand new rivalry that you could do a whole nother show on that might emerge as the two top dogs, kind of like the Florida Georgia or the Florida Alabama in the early 2000s or late 2000s.
For sure, for sure.
So yeah, I think Georgia's set up to do really well. I mean, that's something exciting for them, for fans to be like, it was rough, but a lot of young guys coming back. So I think that's exciting for Georgia, exciting for the SEC to have two really elite teams, and the rest of the SEC is going to be catching up.
Yeah,
it's going to make the whole conference
You
better.
have two elite teams, and teams like South Carolina and Auburn and Mississippi State and LSU, and teams that are on the heels of those guys, and teams that could cause an upset on any Saturday afternoon.
Yeah, so I mean that's something to look forward to. I mean, obviously spring football is probably going to start.
Spring football is right around the corner.
Right around the
corner.
corner.
We will be running right back at it in just a few months.
Yeah, so thank you for being on the show today.
Of course, thanks for having me, Bryce.
This has been Brandon Sudge working with the Macon Telegraph, just really covering Georgia sports, and he's a sophomore here at Georgia. Was reluctant enough to text me after one of the episodes and say, hey, man, I really want to be a part of this. So thanks you for him for coming. Thank you for everyone who is listening and watching. I know some of people are going to be watching on YouTube. Some people are going to be listening on podcasts, whether it's iTunes or SoundCloud. You can catch us all at the Crowded Booth, Facebook, Twitter, and I know Brandon's been promoted a little bit on his Twitter too to try to get us off the ground. Don't forget, we do have T-shirts right here. This is what they look like. Brandon wants the polo, so I might have to get him one of those. But the T-shirt's $10, and anything above an extra large is going to be $13. The next podcast is going to be in Rome, Georgia, where I go to school, Barry, and I don't know, Brandon will probably want to call in on the show. He's just such an avid fan already. But definitely, as we gear up for a whole new thing, that Brandon will definitely be back talking probably about spring football, and then definitely, if y'all don't know, Brandon's a huge Braves fan and a huge fan of the minor league signings that they make. So we'll be definitely highlighting some stuff as coming into the fold.
For sure.
But that's all we have for today, covering some Georgia football and a national championship that was painful, but a good launching pad, maybe for a potential next dynasty for Georgia. For me and Brandon, that's all we have today. Thank you for watching.